Daniel House, thanks for joining the Heart Dealer podcast today.
Absolutely. It's good to be here.
Thank you.
Uh,
Um, I got a lot of questions. We got
Okay.
background, we got music, we got CZ Records. I guess it's not CZ because I'm Canadian. It's CZ.
Yes, right, right, exactly.
Entrepreneurship, kind of main topics, and we're going to go into each one. I just want to start with man, I you seem to be at the crossroads of like 100 different bands, 100 different histories, 100 different artists and producers. Uh, I mean, what does it feel like to you?
It feels like I'm just living my life. I mean, I'm just one of those people. I'm wired in a certain way where I've never I've never been somebody who sits still very well for very long, you know? And my brain is always spinning with a myriad of ideas, and every once in a while I'll just grab up and pluck one and run with it. And I'm not somebody who understands the word boredom, because I'm like, how does anybody get bored if you have this thing called a mind? And my mind is usually spinning faster than is probably good for me. So, for me, it's very important to be doing something that feels innately creative. I like making things out of nothing.
Mhm.
And that has taken on many different forms. I am aware of the things that I've done and the things I've been involved with. It's not like I'm living in a vacuum or anything, but I like to do stuff, and so stuff is what I tend to do.
Were you
Yep.
wired like that from being a kid onwards, or is that something you developed?
Well, I guess in terms of wanting to be creative and being sort of innately uh entrepreneurial, for a loss of a better word, I probably started kind of early. I actually published a comic book when I was like 16 and still in high school. And I worked with my friends. I drew the cover, but for the most part, I was the editor because the friends I worked with were much better artists than I was. Um, and I didn't know what the hell I was doing. I just knew what I wanted to do. So I figured out how to do it. And I was living in the Bay Area at the time, Berkeley, California. Um, and I was a big comic book fanatic anyway, and specifically of undergrounds at that point in time. And so I sought out Last Gasp Comics and talked to their president and owner. This kid, he's 16, he looks like he's 11, and just said, "This is what I want to do, and I don't know, how to do this." And he was cool. He just said, "Well, we do these big gang runs where we run, all these different titles on this huge print sheet, and if you get your files ready, we can include you in one of our runs for a small run of like 1,000 or something." And so that's kind of how I did it. And I had another friend of mine, his friend of my father's really, who ran a design shop, where, everything was all separated by hand and everything. And he did a lot of like logo design and stuff. I don't know if he's still alive anymore, because we're talking, we're talking almost 50 years ago at this point.
Right.
But he taught me all the stuff, how to do things that I didn't know how to do, including like shooting. Like, I had black and white art, and then I used gray pens to kind of create this gray wash for each of the uh, CMYK layers, and then shot them all for individual press separations, and just kind of figured out how to do this thing, and I did it, and I published it. And because I was working with Last Gasp, they carried it for me and distributed it, and it's kind of cool.
That's
So started a long time ago. It's just kind of like, oh, I want to do this thing. How fun. And it was kind of the same way with like a record label, in a sense. I just like, they're fun projects, and then they become work, and you
mhm.
don't think about that when you're first doing it. But
Was a valuable lesson in there that is. It's funny how in life sometimes it's as simple as asking. You know what I mean? Like, hey,
yeah,
you reach out to the comic and you ask, and they say, "Sure, get this done," and all of a sudden there's your path forward.
that I got from my mom. My mom, when I was probably 3, 4 years old, it's a lesson that's always stuck with me, is if there's something you want, you should always ask. And, I mean, very young, she was like, if there's anything that you ask for, the worst thing that's going to happen is they're just simply going to say no. And
Yeah.
you're right where you were before you asked. And when you're 3 or 4, you're kind of fearless and you're not thinking about the world of consequence or anything. So, more often than not, I would ask for something and they'd be like, oh, yeah, how cool. What a precocious little kid. Um, but, I think people are often people are often dominated by a certain level of fear. And I'm like, what are you afraid of? You know,
Yeah.
again, worst thing that's going to happen is I'll say, sorry, but no. Okay. I'll go look under a different rock.
Agreed. Were you, born and raised in Seattle or moved to Seattle?
I moved there when I was 19, shortly about 2 months before my 20th birthday. So, but I wasn't born there, but I often say I was raised there. Like I turned 20 there, I turned 30 there, I turned 40 there. Um, it was the longest I'd ever sort of been in a place. I was there for 22 years. I had my entire musical career was there, my record label, my first 2 mortgages, like those are big milestones.
Absolutely.
Uh, Prior to that, I was up and down the whole west coast of the North American continent between Berkeley and Northern California, much further north, and Washington State, but not specifically Seattle, and then back down to the Bay Area again. And that's where I finished high school.
Nice.
Yeah.
I ask simply because I'm curious about the timeline. Like, when did you go from now that I know this guy making comic books to picking up a bass to knowing that I wanna do music?
hmm Um, well, if we go back to the comic book, that was when I was back in Berkeley finishing high school.
Mhm.
And after high school, I went over to Europe with a friend of mine. The two of us, we went on bicycles and we were over there for 6 or 7 weeks. And we rode for like 1,200, 1,300 miles, went to like 6 different countries. Slept mostly in people's pastures. We had tent and bedrolls and the whole thing. And when I came back, I was just as broke can be. And so on the way, I had lived in Washington before going back to Berkeley on a little tiny island called Guaymas, which is just at the southern tip of the San Juans. If you know where Anacortes is, it's the island immediately north of Anacortes. It has a single little ferry that's like a 5-minute ferry that goes back and forth. And so when I got back from Europe, I wanted to visit my friends Tom and Ben, who were living at that point in Seattle. So I stopped and hung out there for like a month. And that's when I was like, oh shit, I feel like home here. And I was meeting all these people my same approximate age, and they seemed like creative weirdos. And I was like, I found my tribe. And so I came down to Southern California and basically lived with my grandparents for 9 months and just worked and saved money and actually took some classes, took some music classes and some art classes. And, you know, I had decided at this point that I wanted to learn an instrument because I had decided just through my intense, immersive love of music that I wanted to create music. Because the thing is, starting at a very young age, I always heard music in my head, like fully formed music that was coming out of seemingly nowhere. Um, So I got a guitar and I got some books and I tried to teach myself stuff. And I always sucked. I just sucked horribly. But when I moved to Seattle, that was my one thing is like, I want to play music. And I had no idea what that was going to be like, and I was practicing guitar and I continued to always suck. And my friend Tom was one of my friends from the island who was also in the comic book. It's very roundabout, but he was suddenly in a band and I remember being pissed off because I'm like, you don't even play music. You've never even talked about wanting to be in a band, and suddenly you're in a band. So at some point, they had an opening for a bass player, and I'm like, I'll get a bass. I'll play it like anything. And I picked up bass, and suddenly I'm like, oh, this is totally different. And this is something that I immediately took to. Um, it was just a completely different experience. And I think something about the melodic nature of bass versus sort of the chordal structure of guitar was different for me. And I think a lot of that may have just come from all the jazz and soul and R&B I'd grown up listening to as a kid. I think it just kind of seeped in. And in retrospect, when I look back, like that's still some of my favorite music, you know.
Mm.
And to this day, I'm still a shit guitar player.
I don't believe you, but I mean that's amazing.
No, but I'm a good. I mean, I will also very, all ego aside, I have no qualm saying I'm a rock solid bass player, but I can't play guitar for shit. I sound
Sometimes
like
you
I'm.
can do
Yeah,
one
it's
thing
just
really
it's
well,
it's weird. It makes no sense, but there you go.
and then you got other artists like Grohl who seem like they can pick up like the kazoo, and somehow they're a kazoo expert overnight.
I play a mean kazoo.
Bust it out at the end. I want to hear.
Yeah, I don't have one.
It's you said something so poignant there that is so simple in its idea.
Hmm.
You said, "I don't know, I'm just the guy living my life," but to someone
Sure.
else, to me, to outsiders, you're the center of so much activity. You can geek out over all the associations from
Right.
one band alone, not even, including all of them. But yeah, we are all just living our life for the first time, and sometimes things happen and it's a story and other people want to know. I mean, you started making music really in 82, was it? Like early 80s?
Yeah, 80. Yeah, 82. 82.
I was born in 80. So like you're
Okay.
doing things and
I
around
I
80.
I graduated high school in 79, so whatever.
Well, it's just I always felt like I lived 10 years too late. Like
Uh-huh.
I discovered grunge, alternative music in the late 80s, and I would have been just coming up to 10, so from like 8
Okay.
to 14, it was like, "Oh my god, my mind is blown." I was also discovering, hip hop and rap at the same time, and
Mhm.
and I, like
Mhm.
you, grew up on jazz and blues and classical and other forms of music that my parents had introduced me to. But I wanna talk more about that. I'm sure you're bored talking about, the grunge scene, the Seattle scene, but it was so impactful to me.
It was,
Um,
in fact, yeah, it was a big deal, and apparently it still is.
I agree,
But
and
let me ask you a question.
sure.
So you said you felt like you were born 10 years too late, and I'm wondering if most people feel that because I was born in the early 60s, and a lot of the music that came out in the late 60s in my mind is incredibly important. And so I often feel like I was born 10 years too late because I got to experience it, but kind of vicariously. I was in the Bay Area and I was around a lot of that culture. So I experienced some of it kind of firsthand, but like I never got to be a teen or a young adult kind of in that scene, immersed in it.
Mhm.
And I'm just wondering if people generally just kind of feel like there's that era that they just missed from when they were really young, or if that's just, I don't know.
That's a good question. I mean, maybe it's like there's like a half-life, like with 10-year
Hmm.
period that if you're before 5 to 10 years this way, then you do feel that way, but if not, then you're good. I have a buddy in Toronto, Dean. He works at Warner. Him and
Hmm.
I have done so many shows together. He is 5 to 8 years older than me.
Okay.
And a lot of the shows that I wished I had seen, the bands that I wish I had seen, opportunities that I wish I had, he got just because that 5-year differential, because he was
Sure.
just old enough to be, going to a show by himself, whereas I didn't experience that until I had already moved to Europe. Kurt had died, things had changed.
Yeah.
Um, Maybe if I were even just a few years younger, I would have been able to experience those. I don't know. That's a good question though, because I'm sure a lot of people wish that they were born in a different century, let alone decade.
True. True. Yeah.
So 82, things are
Hmm.
starting to happen. 10-minute warning, feedback, skin yard, yeast. I mean, there's more bands probably that I'm missing because I know that you had short little bits here and there. Um,
But everything you just mentioned is a little bit later.
Fair, fair. So why don't you talk to me about like you're starting to make music and then all of a sudden you somehow magically create the grunge sound. Where does this all happen?
I don't know if I want to take credit for that.
Well, it's
um,
you know
well,
what?
my first band was this band called Death of Marat, and nothing was ever recorded other than just like I think some boombox tapes or whatever. And I don't think anybody in the band would be particularly angry at me if I say that we sucked pretty hard. It was all of our first band. Um, it seemed like every member of the band had different influences, and so all of them together was kind of this weird mishmash. Like Chip was really into Devo and the Ventures, and Brad was really into like orchestral maneuvers in the dark, and I was probably I don't know. I was probably into like Bauhaus and Pink Floyd and like early Genesis, or like, I don't know. We were all over the map and we were doing this weird arty punk rock stuff.
Yeah.
And we tried to write things that we actually couldn't really play. So it sounded like this weird, bizarre cacophony, I think. Um, and I left the band before they broke up because I just felt myself feeling frustrated and I wanted to do different things. And I felt musically like I'd kind of outgrown the band. Yeah. And that would have been 82 or I think 83 maybe. Um, but then in 84, I joined two bands simultaneously. Well, I started a band and then I joined a band. So the band I started, and that was a band I pretty much wrote everything in. It was a band called Feedback, and that was the first band I played with Matt Cameron in.
Mhm.
And we were an instrumental trio, the two of us as a rhythm section, and this guy who called himself Nerm, and he played guitar and guitar synth. He was a curious guy and a curious, interesting, kind of weird guitar player. But it was through him that I would meet Jack and Dino. And then at that same time, during that same year, Duff McKagan had left 10 Minute Warning the year before. And they were actually my favorite Seattle band at the time. And I was friends with the bass player and the singer, and we were all going to community college together at the same time. And so when I found out that Duff and the bass player who I was friends with both kind of left at the same time, um, I was very nervous, but I'm like, do you think there's any way I could try out? And I did. And if maybe if you're going to point a finger at sort of the beginning of that whole scene, I might say that maybe it was 10 Minute Warning, because we were kind of the first band that were doing something significantly different that was kind of the blueprint for what would eventually make that city famous.
Absolutely.
And we had like, heavy punk roots, a little more kind of Stooges and Heartbreakers, but like heavy psychedelic, very sexy. Um, some of the weird kind of heroin drone kind of vibes of like Nico Velvet Underground. But it was heavy, it was dark, it was ominous, and there was something about it that wasn't like anything anybody else was doing. And I used to just like worship this band, and then before I knew it, I was actually trying out, and I was actually in the band playing shows. But heroin took that band down, basically. Not me, but a couple other members of the band.
Yeah.
And so basically, 10 Minute Warning and Feedback both kind of imploded at about the same time at the end of '84. And I really loved both bands, even though they were about as opposite as two bands could be. But I had this idea of a band that would combine the aesthetics of those two bands, sort of that heavy, dark, sexy, psychedelic, but also kind of cerebral and heady and maybe a little arty.
Uh,
And that was what Feedback was. And so I reached out to Jack because I had a tape of music that he had done where he played every instrument. And, I just approached him. I said, "Hey, I'm suddenly bandless. My chops are at top form because between those two bands, I was rehearsing 6 nights a week. And, I'm like, let's try this out. This is my idea. What do you think?" And he goes, "Sounds cool." And, we talked about music for a while and then we just plugged in and started playing. And that was the beginning of Skinyard in January of 1985.
that's so cool. It's funny is you said you're just living your life and, so from the outside perspective, it's different. When I look at your band, just Skinyard alone,
Hmm.
a logical perspective, you got Andino, you got Matt Cameron, then you have, Steve, is it Weed or Wyatt, who's with
It's
Tat?
Steve Weed, but he only played two shows with us and he never recorded. So officially speaking, you could say we played with six drummers, but I say we only played with four.
Fair, but where I'm going with this is you got the
Yeah.
names associated with your band,
Hmm.
and then if you I mean, what I did before this is I put on some of your music again, and then for some
Uh-huh,
reason I realized, man, there's such a similarity here between like Ultra Mega OK and like the first two Soundgarden albums. And then you
uh-huh,
start to see the association of the people like Andino, and you say, okay, this I can see how this music logically or this sound logically start to move around within that local scene because of the creative roots that you had.
uh-huh.
Do you feel like that is accurate? That there were people that were all touring and playing together, and so naturally the vibe went around?
Yes, people weren't really touring much that early. But the thing that people sometimes forget is that, especially in those early days, Seattle was a tiny little scene. Seattle was a scene on the touring route that people would often skip. It
Mhm.
was not uncommon for a band to come to Portland and then go to Vancouver and skip Seattle. So we were a very small, insular little scene. Everybody was friends with everybody. We would go to each other's shows, and so it was impossible for us not to sort of have influence on each other, um, because we were all friends with each other. We were sleeping with each other and going to each other's shows and hanging out at each other's parties, and
Yeah,
like it was a tiny little scene, and we I'm sure borrowed and were influenced by each other to a degree, not
yeah,
entirely. Soundgarden, I think probably got some stuff from Skinyard, even though my guess is they would probably go, no, we didn't. But I think they probably did. I know that we certainly um, got influenced by them, and
mhm,
and I mention them specifically because early on, especially Soundgarden and Skinyard were often kind of referred to as sister bands, and not just because of the whole Matt Cameron thing, but just musically, aesthetically, there were certain similarities between Kim Thile and Jack Endino as guitar players. We were both these heavy bands that were more cerebral than most of the other bands. We're the only bands that really would mess around a bit with time signature. We were really the only two bands that were really doing things more textural, where it's like there's a riff, but it's not like here's three instruments playing the riff together. Like there'd be a bass line locked in with the drums, and there'd be Kim or Jack, doing this whole textural guitar thing on top of it. So that was kind of a different approach,
mhm,
and then that being, and both Ben and Chris were more intentional, I guess I'd say, with their melodies. Um, But yeah, we all influence each other. There's no question. But all that said, there's still huge distinction between all the different bands. Like,
definitely.
when you listen to the Deep Six compilation, there's six bands that all complement each other really well. A record that's kind of considered the first sort of official, document of the arrival of grunge, for the lack of a better word. But the bands still don't sound like each other. I mean, we all played on bills with each other, obviously. So it was a statement of a scene, and we complimented each other well, but still had our distinct vibes individually as
Yeah,
bands, you know?
absolutely. And I was by no means implying that anyone was, similar or things I mean, what's the expression? Copying is the most sincere form of
Yeah.
flattery,
Yeah.
there's nothing wrong with that. You see someone that you idolize, you see someone
Sure.
that impresses you, and then you're gonna naturally take on some of those things while still trying to keep your own identity. Um, with that said, like, the term grunge, a lot of people have said that it was created by, the industry or it was used, like, by media to capture this. What is your version of the word that captures the Seattle vibe at that time?
Um, I don't really use a word. I mean, I use that word only because when you use it, people know what you're talking about. I think it's human nature for people to try to sort of put things in boxes and,
Mhm.
categorize. My issue with that word is kind of what I just said. It's like, okay, well, let's just ask the question,
Yeah.
does Pearl Jam sound like Nirvana? Does Tad sound like Skinyard? Do the Melvins sound like Screaming Trees? I mean, these bands are all very distinctly different. And so then you kind of step away and you say, well, it's just kind of a broad aesthetic. Well, what is the aesthetic? It's like heavy, thick guitars is okay. Well, now we're also calling Babes in Toyland grunge, and by extension, maybe you call more of the other bands in Minneapolis grunge. What about L7 down in LA?
Yeah.
What about stoner desert rock? What do you call Caius and all those desert bands? And what do you call Queens of the Stone Age? I mean, like it just keeps moving further and further out. And these are all bands that kind of share certain kinds of aesthetics. So,
Mhm.
so then the question is it a musical definition you're trying to arrive at? Is it an attitude? The one thing that started to happen when it became this national marketing trend was that it became a fashion, which to most of us was kind of weird because there really wasn't a fashion, so to speak. There was the fashion was basically dictated by the fact that it was cold and wet and we're poor. So, you know, and that fashion was also probably, in Portland, and it was probably also in Vancouver. Like people would wear layers and flannel shirts and long johns. And yeah, there was that thing about like long johns with shorts over them and then socks pulled up over the long johns and then boots. But all of those, if you think about it, like most of those articles of clothing are basically functional pieces of clothing for the weather, for the climate in the Northwest.
Yeah,
It's
I
cold
mean,
and wet, and I'm broke. So I want to stay warm in this basement where I'm playing music and drinking beer, and I'm wearing these clothes because there's probably no heat in the basement. I don't know.
it's very
I
true.
don't know.
Very
I
like
mean, I mean, what do you think grunge is? I mean, what do you think of that word?
yeah, I think you captured it pretty well. I mean, for me, it was always just, um, the rawness and
Hmm.
roughness, for lack of a better word, to the
Okay,
sound,
sure.
to take the true feelings. You mentioned heroin, you mentioned, like, the cold basements, you mentioned the weather, taking that and somehow translating it through from the body through this electric instrument or
Hmm.
light instrument outwards, and that had to be rough. It had to be distorted and not polished, imperfect, for lack of better words.
Hmm.
I mean, classical music, very well polished, very
Hmm.
clean. The production value is high, but then you think about people showing up in tuxedos and playing perfectly polished instruments. It kind of goes with the vibe, whereas grunge not so much. But
Well,
the
what if we go?
imperfection is the
What if we
perfection.
go back 15 years and let's go to Michigan
Mhm.
and let's look at the MC5 and the Stooges in 1969. Kind of
Yeah,
the same thing, right?
absolutely.
Kind of what you just described. So is that grunge? I mean, certainly two bands that are hugely influential on the scene that would later be called that, you
Mhm.
know. Like had there not been a Stooges, there may not have been a Seattle rock scene, you know.
Totally
I don't
agree.
know. People just need to sort of categorize, and I think that's just the nature of humankind. Um, you know, I prefer just like heavy raw music. That's not really a descriptor, but it is, right? I mean, it's what it is.
Yeah, I mean, I
And
guess
then I mean, I don't know, is Pearl Jam really that raw? Probably not. They're probably closer to other arena rock bands.
yeah. Oh, especially now. I mean, I guess to your point, it was a marketing tool, and
Yeah,
it was probably easier to market grunge than, Seattle sound scene or whatever it would have been.
sure, sure.
Uh, why did you walk away from music and then have a pivot? And I do wanna talk about the pivot because there's so many fascinating things that you did as an
Hmm.
entrepreneur and where you went with your career,
Hmm.
but, like, what made you kind of say, "Okay, I'm done with the band, I'm done with the bass, now there's labels and web
Hmm.
design and businesses."
Right. Well, it's of course not quite as perfectly linear as that, but so Skin Yard was together for about 6.5 years or so, and we ebbed and flowed certainly in terms of being a functional band, or more importantly, in being a socially functioning band. there were times when there was a lot of tension and difficulty. I mean, we're in our 20s, you know, there's a certain amount of arrogance that comes with that. And,
Mhm.
and I'm certainly, I will take full credit for my arrogance and my cockiness and, the degree to which I may have been an asshole in my 20s. And, also the fact that it was kind of my band. I had the idea for it. I sought out the person I wanted to start it with. I wrote probably 50 to 60% of the music. I did all of our graphics. I booked all of our first shows, our first couple of tours, whatever. I was sort of de facto manager. And so I think to some degree I felt a sense of, for lack of a better word, I don't know, ownership or something.
Mhm.
Uh, Me and Ben clashed a lot for reasons we don't really need to get into. But anyway, we started early. So by the time the band broke up in '91, when was the same time that everything was exploding, right? And we had all of our friends, not all, but so many of our friends were getting signed. We were not in that group of bands being signed. And we had worked our ass off, probably harder than most bands. And, I think we had reached a point of frustration. Something else that had happened to me 2 years prior was I became a father.
Oh, nice.
Um, and that's part of it, but it's not like the whole reason. But part of it was, I never liked touring, and I knew that if I want to sort of indefinitely move forward with Skin Yard, that I would have to actually tour even more, and be absent from my son even more. Um, so I basically gave notice that I was going to leave after the national and European tour for 1000 Smiling Knuckles. And then they made the decision that they were going to do those tours with their new bass player and quote unquote their new sound, which I think is goofy and it sounds like somebody read that in a trade magazine. But whatever. Um, so they got a new bass player and they played their first show in April and they lasted about 6 months and then imploded. So I think the end of the band was inevitable as it
Mhm.
was. Um, as to the reason why I didn't pick up a bass and start a new band, the real reason was because I felt that 1000 Smiling Knuckles was the closest I was ever going to come with my notion of perfection.
Mm.
So when a band, goes in the studio to start creating a record, collectively you have this vision, you have this idea of what you want it to be. And that record, more than any of the other records we ever did, came the closest. Um, and I think by any standard, it's the best record we ever did. And I also I knew that if I started a new band, that I would always be measuring everything I did against that record. And I felt pretty certain that I would not be able to achieve that level and that I would always feel disappointed. Maybe that sounds strange, but I felt like I had reached this pinnacle that I, didn't know if I would ever be able to sort of reach that point in my life. And
Mhm.
and I did. And even to this day, 30 some odd years later, I remain very proud of that particular piece of work. I mean, I'm proud of Skinyard on the whole as a band, but that particular record just kind of achieved this next step that it's hard to imagine kind of doing that again.
Yeah. I mean, I respect that. There are a lot of artists that don't know when to let go. There's a lot of people that don't know when to let go and move on.
Hmm.
TV shows, you name it, in life, there's
Yeah.
this desire to keep going when you've outrun something.
Yeah.
It's like the George Costanza, "I'm leaving on a high note,"
Yeah.
so you left on a high note or what you felt was a
Yep.
high note, and then you start to explore other things. I don't wanna miss out the timeline, but obviously
Hmm.
there was going to school, you got a certificate in web design, you started to, play around with a couple cool different website concepts. There was
Hmm.
obviously the
That
record
was
label.
that was much later
Much
because
later?
well the other piece of that whole puzzle and that whole narrative is the fact that I had already been running CZ Records for
Yeah.
years at this point. Um, So I was very much involved in the local Seattle music scene. So even though Skinyard was a huge majority of my personal identity, that particular pivot was easy because I was already putting out records by other bands and my friends, and you know, until the end of 1990, I was working at Sub Pop as well.
Yeah.
So by the time my last show with Skinyard occurred, I already had my own office for CZ, and I think I had my first employee, maybe two, I don't remember. But I was running the label as an actual full-time concern. Um, so it was easy to make that shift, you know. And I had a lot of success. I launched the careers of Built to Spill, of the Gits, of 7 Year Bitch. Put out the first full length by Silkworm. Um, you know, the first records by Coffin Break. I mean, a Hammerbox, like a lot of music from the Northwest, and a lot of it really was important music as far as I was concerned.
Mhm.
Um, the one of the big shifts that kind of happened was after Kurt died. Um, because that was sort of the one of the biggest things that sort of propelled that scene into the stratosphere. And when he died, it kind of took the knees out from a lot of the infrastructure of the Seattle music scene. Um, and prior I was able to sustain CZ Records with a staff based on the fact that I could sell a minimum number of records of any band, no matter how unknown, if the name Seattle was attached to it.
Mhm.
And then after he died, almost overnight, like it just, I didn't have that guarantee anymore. So things became financially tenuous. Um, and at one point I had to start working real jobs again. And I had to sort of return CZ back to the status of being a hobby, which is how I started.
Yeah.
Um, and it was really only in the late '90s that I pursued that I started studying web development. Um, And that came about because there was this little company called Real Networks, right? Who invented streaming media.
Yep.
And they had this job that I applied for and interviewed for and thought I had it in the bag. The job ended up actually never coming together, but it was a partnership with Rolling Stone. It was just going to be this app called Rolling Stone Radio, and they would be involved in a lot of the programming, but we would be building the actual app, and it was co-branded, and then there was going to be a team basically in Seattle at Real Networks that sort of was a product manager and then worked very closely with the counterpart of Rolling Stone. I was like, this sounds amazing.
Mhm.
And I didn't get the job, but nobody got the job as it turns out. But I impressed everybody and they wrote me back saying, you don't have experience with web and you don't have experience with HTML. I'm like, dude, it's 98. Not many people do, right? So I'm like, well, I'm going to get the Laura LeMay book and I'm just going to absorb every printed word and bit of code and in that tome of a book. And that's what I did. And I taught myself how it all works, and I had a bunch of links up on the web, and so I reached out to all the people I'd interviewed with and said, "Hey, this is what I've been doing. This is what I've been teaching myself. Here's a bunch of links." And they called me that day, and I got hired into the music group at Real Networks as part of the programming, uh, the programming for the music section of the Real Guide.
Yeah.
And actually, interesting, one of the other people that I worked with very close was Matt, who later started Light in the Attic Records. So we worked there together. I don't know if you do. I don't know if you guys know Light in the Attic or not,
Yeah,
but
yeah, I've definitely heard of the label. Yeah, I'm shaking my head because
amazing label, amazing label.
it's fascinating how you have this reoccurring theme of just do it and just ask and things
Yeah,
happen.
yeah. Push
It's
forward.
yeah, it's that easy.
Don't sit
But
still.
before we, like, leave the label for a second, so
Hmm.
I purchased something from the site and I was just fascinated. I love stories. I love history of things. I remember being in
Uh
university and being high out of my mind one night and thinking about, like,
huh.
a chair, and I was like, "Oh, man." then the, like, the wood that made the chair and someone made the wood, but where did that, like, wood come from and who cut down the tree and who planted the tree and how long is the tree? I like to go backwards in the life cycle of things. So talk to me
Mhm.
about this. I got this
Ah,
this CD,
okay.
but it's got, like, this random sticker on it, and then it's got, like, 4 different Best Buy price tags on it. Uh, I'm not gonna open this ever. I just think
Why not?
I can't
Open it.
I can't do it.
Of course you can.
I'd
I'll
rather
s I'll
give
s
it I'd rather give it to
okay.
my kids and let them perpetuate the story.
Okay. Well, the reason the stickers are on there is because, that's this whole other story, where I made a disastrous decision to leave my network of indie distributors and enter into an exclusive distribution deal with Relativity Entertainment Distribution, which is sort of an indie arm, quote unquote, of Sony Distribution.
Okay.
And they had been pursuing us for like literally a year, and they finally wore us down, and we entered into this deal with them, and it was a horribly disastrous decision, because they promised that they were going to take us to this next level of getting our records out to the public. And my biggest concern is, well, what about all the mom and pop indie stores all over America? 'Cause that's our bread and butter. And they're like, oh, no, no, that's not going to be a problem. We're going to continue to service them, but we're going to get you into all the chains and all this. I'm like, okay, fine. The problem is they lied. They got us into all the chains and completely ignored all the indie mom and pops across the board. And so we would do all of our advertising and marketing, through zines and indie channels and college radio. And the stores that people would go to, they couldn't find our records because they were all in these like they would load up indie stores like Sam Goody or whatever with like 300 copies of a Silkworm record.
Mhm.
And they would sell 3 because that's not where people go to find Silkworm. That's where people go to buy, I don't know what was going on at that time. Whitney Houston or mainstream
Yeah.
music. I was not involved in the release of mainstream music. Um, so they managed to effectively, they kind of bankrupt the label inside of 9 months, basically. And so we got this a ton of returns. That's what those stickers are from. Those are
That's so
those are
cool.
stickers from the stores, and we got just they would like order 10,000 and we would get 8,000 back with all the stickers from retail. So it's a brand new CD. It just has these funky stickers on them.
I'm not
That's
concerned with the quality of the CD. I'm more fascinated with that. In fact, I feel like I got a bonus version of
well,
the
that's good.
product. Absolutely the opposite from my intention was that this is incredible, and I wish more of them came like that because then you have that
Oh,
historic.
I've got a lot of them in the garage like that. I mean, I don't even want to tell you how many CDs and vinyl actually went into landfill in 2002, 2003 in preparation to leave Washington and come down to California. Just like so much went into landfill.
Have you ever looked into, I'm sure it'd be an arduous undertaking, but, some kind of, like, historical archive in the Seattle area, a mini museum, an exhibit somewhere just with your product and with your brand?
No, but I mean, you've got Mopop, and
True.
and
Yep.
Mopop has done exactly that. When they were first launching, they had a very deep pockets with which to buy a lot. I mean, they probably have the most extensive, collection of Northwest memorabilia of anybody in the world.
Yeah,
They bought a
I've
bunch of stuff from me, and so there's stuff in permanent collections there. Like actually, if they still have the Nirvana permanent collection, like we're in there.
okay,
You know.
nice. I've been to Mopop, once. The first time I ever went to Seattle, I've only been 2 or 3 times now, but, I
Uh-huh.
checked it out. It was really fascinating. They had a Hendrix experience exhibit at the same time, but I was just more, like, curious about just a CZ one specifically, you know? Maybe in your ba
Yeah. I mean, honestly, if Mopop wanted to do a CZ one, they probably have everything they need. I mean, there have been times when I actually reach out to them because I need high res versions of things that I know they have in the archive. because like they bought tens or thousands, maybe tens of thousands of posters and ephemera, and everything was scanned at the highest level of resolution. So, for instance, when I released the 10-minute warning record, there's this, the inside sleeve is printed on both sides, and one side is this collage of all of these posters from
Mhm.
82, 83 or 83, 84. And like most of those images came courtesy of Mopop, because I knew that they would have the highest resolution scans. So they've got all that stuff. I mean, I would love it if at some point I wouldn't say they should do a CZ uh, uh, exhibit. I think they should do an indie label exhibit of all the indie labels at the time that were not called Sub Pop,
Mhm.
because that's the thing. It's like the Sub Pop story is Sub Pop Rock City, and it completely and very purposefully ignores the fact that there was all of these other bands and quite a number of labels putting out music at
Yeah,
exactly that same time. And it was a very, very rich scene with a whole lot of bands that are not just the ones that appeared on Sub Pop records.
totally
And I'm
agree.
not and I'm not slighting Sub Pop. Like, what they did is of critical importance, and I'm actually really delighted that they're as successful these days as they are. You know, because most labels don't last this long.
Yeah.
But good for them.
You're absolutely right. They're just like markers of that point in time, right? Like you got the Albinis, the Andinos, the Sub Pops, and that's exactly what you think about when you're trying to sum up that scene. But that doesn't
Hmm.
account for the hundreds, if not of thousands, of other people that impacted that and had super important parts in it, like yourself and CZ Records. I'd love to shift to entrepreneurship because
Hmm.
you know transitioning conversationally from here to there. I remember someone talking about ideas and companies and never giving up. And just because something's been done, that doesn't mean that there isn't value in doing it again.
Hmm.
You look at Airbnb. They had love them or hate them, they had the right branding, right marketing at the right time, but there had been
Hmm.
dozens of companies that tried the exact same thing prior that just never hit. And then now you've got VRBO, which is kind of doing the same thing, but it's slightly different, and the market share is small. That doesn't mean they're not relevant.
Yeah.
I worked for BlackBerry for 4 years, and I remember one of my bosses. He was quite high up, pretty sure he was a VP, and we were having a big team meeting, our whole group, and we were talking about like BlackBerry's plunge and all the things that were happening.
Mm.
And he
Hmm.
said, "This is a $1 trillion industry, so you
Right.
guys might
Right.
think of this as the death of something, but 1% of this industry is still massive business.
Right.
And we
Right.
still have
Right.
to take it seriously." Uh, in the spirit of entrepreneurship, you've done so much, and you've run a label, and you've toured and been with the band, and then you get into web design, and now you're starting a podcast and writing a book. How do you
Hmm.
balance it all with yourself, with life, and also with being a father and with family?
I mean, back then,
Then now, I would love to know
I
all of it.
mean, my son is a full grown adult at this point. Like,
Much
you know,
easier.
yeah. Um, but I mean, it sounds like a lot, but it's a lot over the course of a long period of time. So, I'm not, like I'm not, I'm, my life basically consists these days of trying to get this podcast off the ground
Mhm.
and trying to get my book finished. But, I started my book 8 years ago, and I've had like a period of 2 years where I literally didn't touch it at all. Um, and part of that is the fact that a little over 3 years ago, I got COVID, and now I'm one of those unlucky few that actually has been suffering with long COVID I'm in
Mhm.
my fourth year now. So during 2 of those years, I literally couldn't do hardly anything, and I'm getting better, but very, very slowly. Um, I don't know. I mean, at any given time, I like to have a couple of things just keeping me busy. You know, I don't really tend to think about it that much. I think the biggest thing is probably time management,
Mhm.
and um, like there's a part of me. There's a part of me that wonders if I created the podcast so that I could create a distraction for myself from finishing the book, if that makes sense.
Totally.
Um, and part of it's because this book is a very personal book for me, and so there's a weird fear about it.
Mhm.
Like if I wrote a book that wasn't directly involving my own life, I probably would have finished it a long time ago. Like I've already started preliminary work on my second book, and once I get full steam on that, that thing's going to probably happen inside of a year because I'm not as personally invested in terms of my own history. Um,
What do you think it is? Is it a vulnerability, or is it because the material's sensitive and impacts other people?
no, it's definitely not the latter because I don't give a shit. I mean, if anything, I'm trying to pull stuff out of people. Like, dude, you don't need to sugarcoat it. Like,
Yeah.
this is warts and all. Um, I don't know. You know, I think there's a vulnerability piece of it. You know, at one point I was going to write a memoir of my life between the ages of 8 and 15 because I
Mhm.
had a very unique and weird and chaotic childhood that you know is one of these stories that you don't hear much about, but you know, children of hippies kind of thing.
Yeah.
You know, I lived for years off grid with no electricity. I quit school at second grade and didn't go back until seventh grade. Like there's a whole bunch of stories in there, right? Um, and I started working on that at one point, and that one was even more just like it felt like Pandora's box.
Mhm.
And so I just kind of decided to step away from that, you know, because there's a lot of pain. With Skin Yard, there's not so much pain, and you know, for whatever it's worth, like in the last 4 or 5 months, I've actually been very much. I'm trying to do a certain number of hours every week because I'm
Mhm.
really trying to actually get this thing finished. You know, I'm pretty much done with my interviews, and pretty much all the interviews have been transcribed. And at this point, it's just assembly and then writing narrative kind of in between. Um, and every time I sit down and work on it for a couple hours, I'm like, this is great. So I'm 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 fairly close to finishing that. And I'm also realizing how potentially all consuming this podcast is becoming, you know. Um, you know, it's I don't have a team. You know, and I'm spending a lot of time really trying to reach out to guests that I'm like, they'll never say yes. And I've gotten a couple of yeses from people that I thought would never say yes. And that's really exciting.
Yeah.
And the thing is, I know that those interviews will in turn open new doors and bigger doors. And so, you know, I'm excited. So you know, I kind of feel like I have an incentive now to get this damn book finished and shopped and signed, hopefully, and published. And then I can be doing this podcast and then I can start working on this next book as well.
Yeah. Good for you. I mean, you've never stopped yourself from asking, so it was,
Hmm.
inevitable that you were gonna get some of these guests whether you, wanted to or not.
Yeah.
With the book about I've worked with a lot of writers. I've
Hmm.
published, I don't know, 100 to 200,000 articles over the last 20 years easily. I've worked with writers who've gone on to, become editors of magazines and other websites. My business partner, Lance, is easily one of the best writers I've ever worked with in my life. And I know
Yeah.
that with his books, a lot of what he's been through, some of the horrific stuff that he's seen, which I won't share, um, these works become their own form of therapy and release for them, but that makes them
Yes.
equally difficult. Is that what this book is for you? Is this like years of therapy, years of catharsis that's tough?
I think to some degree that's a component. Yeah. I mean, I don't even necessarily try that hard to fully understand like what that weird barrier is inside of my head,
Mhm.
but I recognize it. I'm like, oh, there it is again. And I do sometimes just like I should work on the book. Oh, but look, I could plant that tree over there. Let's go do that instead. You know, like it's a weird thing. You know, like I that fear of success or something. But it's strange because I've never really had that with any other thing I've done.
Mhm.
This book is it's a different animal. But I know once I'm finally done, it's going to be one of the most amazing feelings of satisfaction and accomplishment. Um, so, the fact that I'm now working on it every week, like I can actually see the end of the light at the end of the tunnel, and that's exciting.
Good for you. I'm excited to read
You
it.
know,
I'm sure it's no doubt gonna be filled with all of the rest of the questions or answers to the questions that I would have asked here anyway.
maybe we'll see. We'll see. It's an oral history, so it's like it basically involves interviews with like 60 different people. So it's largely them talking about the band. And so the real trick now is just assembly in a way that feels like it's got narrative fluid. Because
Mhm.
there's other people that have done similar kinds of books that are just sort of just open up a page and go like this, but it doesn't really have a sense of continuity. It's very just kind of, and I'm trying to avoid that. Like I really want it to be like you start at the beginning, you read through,
Yeah.
and the story unfolds through the words of all these different people.
I mean, it makes perfect sense. There's so many relations between or similarities between an album and a book, right? You
Hmm.
have to create a song in a jam session. Sometimes it comes out in 20 minutes, sometimes it takes 20 years. And then once it's
Right.
finally done and you've got all the music assembled, then you have to sequence it and what's the best order based on how you feel like the album should be heard,
Hmm.
chapters. So it's a process. And I think that a lot of writers that we work with
And then
think,
cover art,
oh yeah,
right?
and then the cover art, credits, it goes on, and then, "Oh, yeah, it's done now, it should be easy." Well, no, that's just the first stage, and then it gets harder
Yeah.
from there because then you have to, like you said, get it published, released, printed, etcetera, distributed. It's a hard thing, overall. I went through a couple hard years, and I'll just leave on my end at this point, and for me, I was desperately I had done some bad stuff, not like bad, bad, but I had wronged my ex-wife, and I had done some
Hmm.
bad things in our marriage, and when the truth started to come out, I would get defensive or protective about it, and my counselor and therapist at the time was saying, "You're trying to control the narrative, and this is a normal reaction, but you have to learn how to
Sure.
forgive yourself and not control the narrative because people are gonna make up whatever decision they think or opinion, form an opinion about you no matter what. All
Hmm.
you can control is yourself and your reactions. So just focus on being a better man and bettering yourself, and that's what you're gonna
Right.
carry forward, and ultimately, their opinions may never change. All that matters
Sure.
is you. So just
All
keep right,
all true.
you know.
It's all true. Like you can't control what other people think or say about you. And it's funny too, because like I have met people in Seattle who we've had really nice conversations and like, oh, what's your name? I'm like, Daniel. Like, what's your last name? House? I go, oh, because they'd heard stuff about me. And I'm like, what? Like, oh, well, I've heard stuff about you. I'm like, yeah, okay. I don't know what you've heard and I don't know who you heard it from, but you literally just had a conversation with me and that's what you should be basing whatever judgment you're passing. But
Agreed.
it doesn't work that way. And you just kind of go, okay, well, if this is your thing, that's your thing. I can't control it and I'm not going to sit here and try to grovel for your friendship.
Yeah,
So, and the other thing too, I mean, it's and I'm guilty of this sometimes as well, that, you hold on to things that maybe you're holding against certain people from things that occurred or interactions you had 20 or 30 years ago. And I know I'm absolutely not the same person I was 20 or 30 years ago. So I
yeah,
should maybe extend them that grace as well to kind of go, all right, I'll give you the chance to sort of prove you're somebody other than who I remember you to be,
100%.
you
That
know?
we are not defined by the bad things we've done, but by the summary of all the actions that we've done in our
Hmm.
lives. Yeah,
And
I
if
mean,
you're paying attention to your own life, presumably and hopefully you are um, always on a path of evolution to try to evolve and become a better person, a better version of yourself as a person. So I'm always trying to sort of become a better version of myself, and reflect on what that means.
absolutely. Every day, totally agree with you. It's I guess going back full circle to the beginning of this, it's keep going, don't take no for an answer, keep asking. The only thing you have in life is momentum and creation.
Yeah.
I'd
And
love to end with, some thoughts on your end. I'll give you like kind of free roam. I know you have the book coming, and then you have the podcast.
Hmm.
What can people expect? Where can they find them?
Well, the book I don't know because it's not done, and once it is done, I'm going to actively try to shop it to get published. But the name of the book is Words on Bone, and it's basically kind of the history of Skin Yard as told by the people who were there. The podcast is called the Creative Asylum. Um, the first episode will actually go like we're recording on the 22nd of September, and tomorrow,
Mhm.
the 23rd of September, it will actually go live, the first episode. And that's going to be a weekly podcast, long form conversations, unscripted, very much like this, um, with various creative people. And it's the kind of underpinning of the whole thing is having conversations with people who are innately creative and sort of how they think about their lives, what they do in their lives to remain creative, to uh, to keep authenticity alive. You
Mhm.
know, so I think a lot of people sort of have passions in life that they don't always try to authentically follow as kind of a guiding light in their life, and that's sort of the answers to like why I'm always doing this stuff. And that's kind of why, because I have these passions. And if I'm going to live the happiest life, I should be authentic to what those passions are. And
Yeah.
however they might manifest. And so, I'm hoping that when people hear these conversations with people, it might light a spark in them to kind of go, that thing I've always wanted to do, but never have. Maybe I should. Like, life doesn't have to be binary. It doesn't have to be an either or,
Mhm.
and it doesn't have to be for money. You can have a thing you want to do and just do it for the love of doing it.
Yeah.
And that's really the best reason. I would love to eventually, get monetized with my podcast and, I would eventually like to make some money doing it, but there's no guarantee. And that's not the motivating factor. So, it's not unlike talking to a young band and, they're like, we're 19 and 20 and we just love everything you've done. And could you give me a tip? And I'm like, yeah, I'll give you a tip. And the tip is, you know, do it out of love of doing it. Don't be don't be in a band because you want to try to make money. If you make money, great, but that should not be the guiding principle.
I totally agree. It's funny, right? We're all working hard to generate revenue, generate wealth. True wealth is
Hmm.
satisfaction, is happiness, right? Is feeling fulfilled in what you're
Hmm.
doing. And then if you can
Hmm.
monetize that, that's the best
Yeah.
possible thing.
It's a bonus, but that shouldn't be the reason why first get into it.
Yeah. I knew that I would end up saying something else, but you said something so important. I wanted to ask about artists and what would you tell
Hmm.
artists in the industry today? Because you've been a musician and run a label. I think authenticity is so important. The number of artists that I talk to that are like, I just want to be famous and have a million streams and this. You're supposed to be creating art for art's sake. I mean,
Hmm.
if you look at where music started, maybe not where it started, but if you look at the Mozart examples, the Beethoven examples, these people made money barely off of performance. Everything else was not generating anything for them. They created because they had to. They were musicians because
Hmm.
they had to be musicians and they
Yeah.
had to get it out. Period.
Yeah. And that's why I do what I do, you know. I mean, even if you're, you know, broke beyond words, if you're creating beauty and putting something in the world that's making the world a better place, there's a lot of satisfaction in that, you know. And if you can and if that thing can turn into the way you make your living, that's fantastic.